All right, everyone. Hello and welcome to another episode of Debunk the Funk. I am Dr. Wilson, and with me today I have Lydia Greene, host of Back to the Vax. Lydia, how are you doing?
Hi, I'm doing well.
Awesome.
Just started my preceptorship. I'm almost a nurse, not quite, but
Mhm.
almost there. Like so close.
Yeah, and you administered your first vaccine just recently, right?
Yeah, just the day before yesterday, we had somebody in with an injury, and we looked up their tetanus status, and I got to give them a tetanus shot.
That's really cool considering your background, which I think we should start with. Um,
Yeah.
so, from just recently giving your first vaccine, rewind all the way back to when you were in the anti-vaccine rabbit hole. Uh,
I'll even go before that
okay,
because
yeah.
before I was an anti-vaxxer, I worked as a pharmaceutical quality control chemist or a
Mhm.
manufacturing plant. And so I had a bit of a background in science, and I was actually pro-vaccine. I went and had a flu shot every year. Even when I was pregnant with my daughter, my first kid, I went and had a flu shot while pregnant. So I was not an anti-vaccine person. Um, and then that changed when I had a daughter. And it wasn't even, it didn't start with vaccinations. It started with just losing my trust in the medical system where my daughter, I couldn't breastfeed her. I had a hard time breastfeeding her, and the doctor was very unhelpful and said things like, don't be so brokenhearted if it doesn't work out. And so I kind of felt let down there, and I joined an online forum that was natural parenting because they prefer breastfeeding. And I thought, well, I'll get advice from them. And the advice worked. And then I remember taking my daughter for her first series of vaccinations, which in Canada we don't do Hep B, so she never had a single vaccine before that. And I just remember feeling really nervous and like probably read something about it in those groups, but I still was wanting to vaccinate her at that time. And I did. And then I took her home, and a few hours later, she started this crying jag, and it was awful. And as a first time mom, I never even heard my daughter cry. Really, I can say that she was a very happy baby, very easy to keep happy, maybe whined a little bit if she got a little hungry or cold or something, but she never fully cried. And so that was the first time I actually heard her cry. And it scared me. And I called in. She would cry, and then she would sleep this really deep sleep, and she would just nurse poorly. And we'd already like gone through some issues with nursing, so I felt like I regressed that way. And then um, I called public health, and public health, she kind of brushed me off and made me feel like I didn't know my own child. So like that's totally normal. If you really believed it was serious, you would take her to the emerge, and like just you're just being a first time mom. Everything sounds fine to me. She'll come through it. And it just seemed very almost condescending and just didn't make me feel better about it. And then I also kind of became afraid to bring her in. Like, what if I get treated like that again?
Mhm.
And so I just basically stayed up for 3 days with her and just watched her like a hawk and slept not at all because I was just so worried. And I went back to the forums that gave me advice before, and I told them what she was going through, and they told me it was DTaP cry. And that's a thing in anti-vax groups where they can point to the inserts, which I now know are just legal documents, and they report adverse events regardless of whether they had to do with the vaccine or not.
Mhm.
And but I believed them. I believed that I hurt my kid with DTaP and that she potentially had brain swelling because that's what they call it, DTaP encephalitis or cryencephalitis or DTaP cry. Those are some of the common terms for it. And it made me wonder if I maybe damaged my kid somehow and I would have to wait until she was older to know. And I just felt worried
Mhm.
to the point where I took her to her 4-month shots, but I skipped DTaP and I did the other two vaccines that she was due for. And then I just never took her back to get vaccinated. So those were the only vaccines she had. I had 2 more kids, and I never vaccinated them either. And I thought I was doing what was best for my children. So that's how I fell into the world of anti-vax.
Mm-hmm. And then now you have worked your way out of it, obviously.
Yeah.
So yeah, talk to us about that.
When COVID happened, I started noticing some hypocrisies in the anti-vax movement. So one of the things that we said in the natural forum I was on, which is called Mothering, you can look into it. You can see my old posts are all still there in the forum. But they had said, like, we would do things like hygiene, like sanitation is what really brought down disease. That's what they said. And so I kind of fell into like all of the tropes over time. It didn't start off that way. And I certainly questioned things more in the beginning, but after a while, you just kind of, it's very cult-like almost in that way that you just stop looking into things and just parrot these lines over and over and just believe them. And they said sanitation, and I agree, sanitation probably did help reduce disease, but not alone. I mean, vaccine definitely helped with that. But when COVID happened, nobody wanted to do anything. Like, nobody wanted to wear a mask. Nobody wanted to use hand sanitizer. Like, they didn't want to use any of the sanitation things that they said that they credited for reducing disease. And I just thought, wow, that's really weird, because like I've been in this movement for a decade now, and like that's what we said we would do. If there was a measles outbreak, we would isolate. They wanted to quarantine their kids. They talked, yeah, that's understandable. Yeah, I'll keep my unvaccinated kid home if there's a measles outbreak or something. Like, these are the things we talked about in these groups, and now nobody wants to do these things. They don't want to quarantine. They don't want to use hand sanitizer. They don't want to wear a mask. They don't want to do anything. So I just felt like that was really hypocritical. And I just kind of saw the movement change as well to like more conspiracy theorist, extreme right-wing kind of things, where when I started, it was more like liberal, left-leaning, college-educated, just people trying to do what's best for their kids. So I kind of saw this shift in thinking too, where it was more like satanic panic and just really started to not make sense. So I had no choice. I either had to like really ignore a lot of things that just didn't add up, or start investigating and like leave my echo chamber and see for myself if I actually believe things that are true. And so that's what started it. And so when COVID happened, I was thinking about, not necessarily COVID vaccines because they weren't out yet, but maybe vaccinating my children for some of the more major illnesses in case things start to crumble, like infrastructure and healthcare. And so I started questioning, like, which vaccine should I give my kid? When does the blood-brain barrier close? Because my youngest was 2. And I was like, well, I've heard it's 2 in some groups, but 3 in others. But I never actually read a study on it. I just kind of believed it. And it, like, I guess it kind of makes sense. Like, a baby would have an immature blood-brain barrier. Like, I didn't really think about it too much. And then I tried to find data to support that, and there was none. Like, zero. There's no information that supports that whatsoever. And I was like, I had to sit with like being super, like, really wrong. And then that's what really started me challenging all the other stuff I believed, like one by one.
Yeah. I mean, I totally relate to that, having believed things like 9/11 was an inside job and lots of things like that when I was like in my high school years, and then having to slowly come out of that and realize claim by claim, one by one, as you said, that I was wrong. And for me, it took a while. It took several months. So it took you some time to get out of that anti-vaccine rabbit hole. And now I want to talk a little bit about what got you out of there. But first, I want to mention what you do now, which is you host a podcast called Back to the Vax, and you also have a Facebook group which supports people who are also exiting that anti-vaccine rabbit hole. And so can you talk about what your approach is with supporting them and what you do with the podcast?
Yeah. So the group, which I mean, it's not super active, but we have parents like when they're starting, they tend to need some support. Like they'll talk about their fears and how scary it is for that, especially that first appointment. I've noticed that the parents in the groups really struggle, and I did too. I had to take an Ativan for my first
Mhm.
appointment because I thought I would just slap the needle out of the doctor's arm, like I'm not going to actually let this happen. It's even though I know logically it's fine and most people are fine, like it just didn't feel I still felt very afraid. And
Mhm.
so the parents in my group are also very afraid. And so we support each other through anxiety. We don't give out medical advice. I make sure I'm very clear about that. We're not giving medical advice. We don't share misinformation. If it's not evidence-based, you can't really talk about it because then the group devolves or gets re-scared. And I don't want that happening. So we have experts. You're in there. Dr. Alamad is in there. There's a few others where if they do need to ask an expert, they can and get evidence-based information on what they want to know. Because it's really hard, when you hear things about vaccines that scare you, like aluminum can cross the blood-brain barrier and cause brain damage. And it sounds plausible if you don't know how all that works.
Mhm.
It's scary. So I'm trying to make sure it's from an evidence-based standpoint and invite an expert in that realm to explain it
Mhm.
so they can feel less anxious. And yeah, when we do vaccinate our kids, we celebrate it. We all say, congrats, good job. It and so far everyone has been fine,
Mhm.
because that's statistically the likely outcome of anything
Mhm.
vaccinating their kid is their kid's going to be just fine. And once you see that with your own eyes, it becomes easier. So that, like most people really struggle with that the first one or two visits, but after that, I mean, I did the same thing where I, kind of did a little bit in the beginning and then I quickly realized the worst part is the actual appointment where you're having to convince your kids to sit down and get an injection. So
Mhm.
I just wanted to hurry that up as much as I could. So I did as many as I could per appointment after a while because it's just as traumatic to get one as it is to get three. So,
Mhm.
and then it's over in less appointments. So
Mhm.
I ended up doing that after seeing that they were fine, that
Yeah.
it was okay. And I think my oldest had like 4 shots at her very last catch-up appointment. So, and really she had sore arms, which is to be expected. She had 2 injections in each arm. So
Mhm.
that was
Right.
really all that happened.
Yeah. And that's what's going to happen most of the time. Yeah.
Yeah. And so when I get to share those stories about my kids' experience and how they fared okay, even my daughter, after she quote unquote had her reaction, never reacted poorly to a DTaP shot. She had to catch up on the series, so never had a poor reaction after what I saw, as when she was a baby. So yeah, it worked out just fine.
Mhm. Yeah. So that's interesting that you approach it like you would, it sounds like, other anxieties. Like,
Hmm.
I know personally, I used to be really afraid of flying, air travel. And a lot of the same things that you just mentioned were part of my process of addressing that anxiety. Like, um, finding a support group
Yeah.
that'll talk me through it and then say congratulations when I complete a flight.
Yeah.
And even taking an Ativan, sometimes you got to
Yeah.
do that.
Yeah. If your doctor, if you're already prescribed the Ativan and you have anxiety issues, take an Ativan and it helps you get through it. Like, because sometimes we can't control our flight or fight response,
Hmm.
and that's what these, medications are for. If you prescribed it, like that can be certainly part of your journey to take that first step. And then I only needed it the one time. I
Hmm.
didn't need it after that. I wasn't taking it before every vaccine appointment. It was just to get through the door. I just
Hmm.
needed to get through that door and,
Yes.
and because I was very worked up about it. But after I saw they were fine, and that's how exposure therapy goes with lots of phobias
Mm-hmm.
and things like that, is, the first exposure is the worst. You feel horrible. But when you get through it, you learn, oh, wow, I didn't die.
Right.
It's going to be okay. We're
Right.
going to be okay. So,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, I wonder, one of the things that I employed when I was trying to address my fear of flying was saying, like you just said, I didn't die. And thinking back to my other flights that I had taken before I developed this fear and thinking I didn't die then. But another thing that I thought about was, okay, tens of thousands of flights are happening every day, and all these people are fine. They're not, they're just fine. And with vaccines, millions of people are getting vaccinated every day, or hundreds of thousands, if not millions. And the vast, vast majority of them are fine.
And that's what I try to focus on, is like the risk benefit analysis favors vaccination. Mm-hmm. So yes, if you have a horrible reaction, your specific risk for that reaction was 100%, because statistics apply to the group and not the individual. So when something happens to you, that was 100% chance of it happening to you once it's happened, right? But we can look at it from a group perspective, as statistics are supposed to be viewed from, and go, wow, that the risk itself is really low. So when you make that choice to do that thing, the risk benefit analysis favors making that choice. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of what I hold on to when I think about vaccination and vaccinating my family.
Mm-hmm. Right. But so when you didn't believe that, when you were sucked into, the opposite view, what were some things that made you realize that some of the core beliefs you had held were crumbling away?
So my huge reason for like, my daughter's reaction was the catalyst, but to continue not vaccinating my kids, I'm severely autoimmune, and the group shares this one poorly done study called the Asia study, where it's like adjuvant something induced autoimmunity. I can't remember the acronym stands for, but it basically blames adjuvants for triggering autoimmune disease. Mm-hmm. And so I'm really autoimmune. I have the most severe form of Crohn's disease, it's fistulating Crohn's disease, and I've had it severely. I've had sepsis. I've almost died. It's been awful. Like, I'm in remission now, thank goodness, thanks to my medication, but I've had a few close calls with my illness. And so hearing that made me afraid to vaccinate my kids and trigger an autoimmune disease in them. And then not realizing that viral infections and bacterial infections actually are much more likely to trigger autoimmune disease than any vaccine. And there's well-documented studies that are much better done than that small mouse Asia study, which used like the amount of adjuvant they used in those mice was way higher than any vaccine would ever have. And it was just poorly done, but it was enough for me to be afraid to vaccinate my kids. And then, of course, they never talk about the other studies. That's the thing, is like, it's very cherry picked. They never bring up the other studies that also show, like, hey, did you know if your kid gets rotavirus, they're more likely to get autoimmune disease? Like, that's a thing, and that's a well-documented phenomenon. So just realizing that there was more to the studies that they were showing me and cherry picking to make me afraid, because you cannot, it always comes back to vaccines cause everything bad to children. And so you can't ever even say, like, well, what about, like, Heather says it really well. She said in the group, to her group of anti-vaxxers, I don't think you can say one vaccine never saved one life. And they turned on her. They turned on her for saying that. And because it is very much like, they'll keep you in line. You cannot bring in certain pieces of evidence. You cannot bring in certain studies. because they don't want to talk about it, and they'll quickly brush it off saying that it's industry funded, when if you actually look, they're not industry funded. But it's the same old excuse every time when they're presented with a study that they don't like.
Mm-hmm.
And that's another thing. When I was deconstructing all of that, I realized, like, yeah, I did that too. If someone gave me information that contradicted what I believed, I just said, big bad pharma, and like, just waved it away.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of those studies aren't actually funded. Like, they don't have a conflict of interest.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But they just assume they do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, most studies are funded just by grants that are like neutral.
Yeah.
Coming from usually the NIH, NSF, or bodies similar to it from other countries, or even charities. Not many studies that are in primary literature are funded by big pharma.
And that doesn't automatically negate. You can't negate every study ever done by big pharma. Like, yes, obviously there's a conflict of interest. You can take it with a grain of salt, especially if the result of the study impacts their bottom line. But not every study will impact their bottom line. And so some of them are just, collecting data. It's not really, much more than that. And you can't assume that every single one is not applicable or valuable because of what funded it. Especially if there's often other studies that aren't, around the same subject, because that causes other scientists to also investigate. So there's many. That's the other thing when I was writing our booklet, is there's many studies on the same exact subject.
Right. And maybe, so we should probably mention a few things. One, Heather is your co-host, who has a similar story to you, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And the booklet you just mentioned, that's kind of a recent thing that you wrote with Heather, right? And it's to help people who are worried about vaccines address the common concerns that maybe conspiracy theorists might be spreading about them.
Yeah. Right? I don't have a lot of, it might help people that are already anti-vax. Probably not, but it might. But my main thing is, like, for someone that's just pregnant or just had a baby and they're starting to hear stuff from people like me who said things to people who just had a baby or were just pregnant, to have a baseline knowledge of all of the tropes. So then when somebody like who I used to be comes up to them and tells them something about vaccines, they can go, that's baloney.
Right.
Right? Because information can also inoculate us, and so had I known that similar stuff, when I heard these things, when the mothers in that group were trying to scare me, I would have been able to say, yeah, that's not right. That's not how it works. But I was vulnerable as being a first-time mom and worried, and I think it was just like the perfect storm of circumstance that just dragged me into that whole lifestyle, and it affected me more than vaccine. It messed with my health. It gave me an eating disorder, which I talk about all this pretty openly because I think there are lots of moms like me who wake up an anxious mess every day over every little thing that they're putting into their body, that they're putting into their child's body, and they just cannot relax for a minute. And that's basically how my parenting journey went for a decade, where I was just constantly monitoring and not relaxing when I could have just let my kids have fun and have fun with my kids instead of like, no, don't eat that candy. No, don't eat that. Like, if everything in my house is okay, does it really matter if they have food coloring and whatever junk fructose corn syrup at someone's birthday? No. But I didn't see it that way, because when you start being in that wellness culture, like, you learn so much about everything that everything becomes poison.
Yeah.
And your whole world revolves around food and products and whatever you like everything, like your shampoo, your toiletries, the food you eat, the everything. It goes around your cleaner. Like everything is just analyzed, and you just never feel relaxed. And I know there are other moms like that. And a lot of them, when they're really into it, they actually resent me for what I have to say because they're not ready to let that control go. So they have to kind of tell themselves I'm full of crap because it is a very much a control thing and that's where a lot of things like eating disorders come from, is this sense of control that is underlined with anxiety. I really do think we have to start looking at it as an anxiety issue for most moms like that were like Heather and I.
Yeah. That's really interesting. And so what I, I've had a couple of these conversations already, and one of the points that I always have a tough time answering is, what do we do? What do we need to do better to tackle this anti-vax problem, to address the fact that there are a lot of people who are having concerns about vaccines? Is it education? Is it in our approach? Is there a systematic way we can do it? But, I think here, talking about acknowledging it more as an anxiety thing, and just maybe asking people, well, what scares you about this vaccine? That might be a way
and to let them talk. Because I know it happened to both Heather and I, where the doctor didn't want to hear what we had to say. And they would shut down and shut us out and get even hostile. And that definitely didn't help things. And also, say, if you don't know in the moment, just say so. You don't have to cover every gap. If you don't have to make up stuff to bridge things that you don't know about, because I'll tell you, we know what we've read. And, that's one thing anti-vaxxers do, is just read, and they know those studies in and out that they cherry pick. So if you're not ready for it, and you say something that's wrong, they'll remember. So you're better off saying you don't know and that you'll look into it and send me a link and let me look into it for you, because at least then it looks like you're working with the parent and not against them. That's interesting. I've never heard that. Can you please send me the information you have so I can look at it and come back with more information on that subject for you? Because that would go a lot further than getting hostile or mean or shutting people down. Don't ask a parent, do you want your kid to die? I've had that happen to me, And no, I don't want my kid to die. And the reason I'm not vaccinating her is from a place of protection. I feel like I'm doing what's best for her and I'm protecting her from harm. And I know you don't think that, but I think that. So that's where my motivation is coming from. So you have to reframe it, because every parent wants to protect their child. So you have to figure out a way to reframe it so that they feel like they're protecting their child with vaccines, right? Because if they don't feel that way about vaccines, they're never going to vaccinate.
Right. Yeah. It feels like that doctor you described is just watched that clip from House where he's talking to that anti-vax parent.
Yeah. And I'm sure it's great TV and everyone watching it is like, get her. You get her.
Right. But that's not real life.
It's not going to change her. It's not going to change. She's going to go home and she's going to have an axe to grind. And she's going to dig her feet in further because you were kind of a jerk. And it's not going to make... And she may not change her mind right away. But you want her to come to you when she does. You want her to feel free to ask for questions, to know that this is a conversation. And then she may not want to vaccinate with all of the vaccines right away, but you have to look at it from a harm reduction, because there are doctors that will kick you out of their practice if you don't vaccinate exactly how they want to. But Heather and I both believe if that child ends up fully vaccinated by age 5, you have a fully vaccinated kid going to kindergarten. That's great. That's what we want, for that herd immunity. And so if it took a little longer to get there and you practice what I think is harm reduction at the end of the day, if you're supporting them through their anxiety, vaccinating slow as they want to, if that kid is fully vaccinated by kindergarten, you won. Because if that parent goes somewhere else to a non-vaccinating practice or a chiropractor, heaven forbid, that kid's never getting vaccinated. And it took me 12 years to come around. 12 years that my children were not vaccinated out in society. That's bad. So I get why they're thinking like, oh, I don't want to deal with these parents or whatever. But then you've created an even bigger problem of having holes in herd immunity that may have not have been there if you let them just vaccinate how they want to and say, I don't care how you do it, just catch them up by 5. Like, we're going to have a fully vaccinated 5-year-old. I recommend the full schedule. I understand you have anxiety. So we're going to go through it together. And by the time your kid's in kindergarten, they're going to be fully vaccinated. I think a lot of parents who are hesitant would be happy to hear that.
Yeah.
Because a lot of parents are just hesitant and not necessarily anti-vax. Just scared. And they just need someone to hold their hand through it. I always I talk to doctors like in conferences where I say like, be available for those first shots. You won't have to be available after that. But for their first set of vaccines and they call you and they're like, I'm really scared, you better pick up your phone and deal with that. Because if they have to deal with that alone and they start Googling and like, you're done. Yep. So like, you don't have to be like that there for every vaccine, but for that first set, you should be there, especially if they were hesitant.
I totally agree. I mean, one thing I've said before is that scientists, I think, need better training when they're doing their PhD or their master's or whatever, that they need better training in communication. They need to be able to explain their project and their work and why it's important to the general public and not just their colleagues or the people in their lab. And I think doctors would benefit from the same thing. As far as I know, medical degree curriculum does not include much on effective communication to a parent that might be anti-vax or otherwise questioning the medical system.
Well received. When Heather and I go to conferences and talk about this, people want the Q&A could go on forever because I think healthcare does realize it's an urgent issue right now and it's going to get worse. And they actually listen to us and hear us out. And Heather, she does this thing where, because we have slideshows and we go up in front of like 200 people and do our thing, and which I never thought I would ever do ever. I didn't think I was a good public speaker, but I guess I am. But she goes up there and she goes, listen, you guys say you don't have time, but I just explained all of this about aluminum to you in 1 minute. It took me 1 minute to explain why aluminum cannot cross the blood-brain barrier. So I think you could say that to a patient in 1 minute. But if not, that's why we wrote the booklet. So you can just, here you go. And that's really what our goal was. Whether they want to do it as a tear-off sheet or if they want to give out the whole booklet, however they want to do it, it's something that they can give hesitant parents when they feel like they're pressed for time and they just want to help the parent understand all, like, how those tropes are actually factually incorrect.
Yeah, I mean, it's brilliant. I mean, that's like my solution that I just said of training doctors to communicate better. That'll take a long time, and not every doctor is going to be good at it still. But you creating something like a booklet, I mean, that's great, because then doctors don't have to do the extra work to gain skills that they never learned. They can just hand something out and and make it that much easier.
So I always have to look at the cover. This is so funny. You're going to think it's funny. So I always have to look at the cover of my booklet because it started off as one title And then like right before they released it, they changed the title.
Mm-hmm.
So every time I think about the title of my book, I feel confused because it was one thing for so long and then they changed it and I can't remember. So I had to look at the title of my book. I know it's silly, but just to let your viewers know, the book is called Vaccine Fears Overturned by Facts.
Mm-hmm.
And you can find it on the Immunize Kansas Coalition website, or you can find it on our website, backtothevax.com. So those are some places. There's a Spanish version too, which I think is really great.
Nice.
And that's the book that I was talking about. But I had to look at the title page because I think it was called Facts Over Fears or something at the beginning. And so I always think it's that. And then I'm like, no, that's not it.
Well, I'm glad that
I had a booklet published, and I can barely remember what it's called. That's that's not having a mom brain. I don't know what is.
It sounds like mom brain, but I mean, it's fantastic that it's published, and I hope that more doctors' offices take it up.
Yeah.
And
it's totally free. You can pick it up for free. You can print it off. You might have to pay to, like, if you wanted a coil bound booklet or something, pay Staples to do that. But yeah, you can print it off. You can download the PDF. It's free, and it will always be free. And yeah.
Hear that, folks? It's all free. It's not a subscription plan or a supplement plan that you have to pay for.
Yeah, I don't get royalties from it. I get 10% of zero.
Yes. Oh man. So I think we're getting close to the end of this, but before we wrap up, let's dive into the myth that you've been mentioning this whole time, that aluminum crosses the blood-brain barrier, and talk just for a little bit about why that's false.
So the anti-vax community, they really love this old study where polysorbate 80 was injected into a rat's carotid and like opened the blood-brain barrier. And so they think like the nanograms of polysorbate 80 in a vaccine is enough to open up the blood-brain barrier. But if you actually extrapolate the data, I think you would need 8,000 Hep B vaccines injected into a newborn's carotid to have a chance at opening the blood-brain barrier. If you extrapolate the concentration that was required to do it in the rat study that now happened probably 60 years ago. It's such an old study. It had nothing to do with vaccination. It was just polysorbate 80. Nothing to do with aluminum. But this is their holy grail, the nail in the coffin, so to speak, for why you should never give your kid a vaccine. And I love Abraham because he's willing to talk to anybody who will listen about that very topic, because that's his job. He tries to open the blood-brain barrier to get cancer drugs across to treat glioblastoma. And he's like, if vaccines were any good at it, we'd know. Like, we would know.
If all it took was aluminum, then we would have a lot more effective drugs for brain cancers.
So hard. So the little tiny minute amount that's in a vaccine will never do it. And the aluminum salts are way too big to cross the blood-brain barrier. And he has a way to explain how the form of aluminum that's found post-mortem is from environmental aluminum, because the form that it's in is environmental. It's not from vaccination. And because that's another study they used, which they didn't have control brains. They just took 12 post-mortem samples from autistic kids and said, look at this aluminum. But they didn't look at regular brains in that study that they quote, and they didn't clarify where that aluminum came from. And we are exposed to aluminum in our diet every day.
Yep. Chris Exley studies, right?
Yep. Yeah, they love
the guy.
Exley. And it is so easy to debunk those studies. But yeah, we cover that in the booklet. We cover I think 20 tropes about childhood and COVID vaccines, just so people, have all that information. And I had it reviewed by experts too. I don't want to proclaim myself as an expert. That's the other thing. I don't want to don't call me an expert. I'm not an expert. I just talk to experts, like actual experts in that field, not, renegades who are being contradictory for the sake of being that way. So, yeah. And just never take, that's one thing I just don't want to ever put myself on that kind of pedestal and say, I'm an expert on vaccines, because I'm not. I just like talking about them.
And that's, I mean, it's needed to have someone like you be a liaison, so to speak, between the experts who do the work and might not be so great at communicating, and the lay people who need to hear the information that the experts are producing.
And just how I was wrong. Like, I'm not afraid to say it. I was wrong, and it's okay, and I lived through it. I mean, thankfully nothing happened to my kids, and I've even come so far as to say I'm very grateful for herd immunity, because at the end of the day, that's why my kids were okay.
Right.
Yeah. And that's why it's important to have, because there are people that legitimately can't get vaccinated. And it's our job as a society and a community to protect them. And like a lot of people, you could talk about that forever, is like our system of like toxic individuality, where people just don't care about others anymore. It's all, they're all out for themselves. And that's not what a community is or does and shouldn't be like. So.
Yeah. Unfortunately.
That's a whole other topic.
It is. But unfortunately, I hear people say, just the other day, I heard someone say, well, I'm not vaccinated and my kids aren't vaccinated and we're all fine. And they treat that as some proof that they don't need vaccines.
Yeah.
And that people don't need vaccines.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Yeah.
Because what else can you say? Like, it's because of herd immunity. But they don't even believe in herd immunity. That's another trope I cover. The fact that they don't think herd immunity is real. That's easily debunked. That they cause autoimmune disease, that they cause allergies, that they cause cancer, that they cause infertility. We touch on all of it.
Yeah.
Because those are very common, and they get recycled.
Oh, yeah.
We saw that with COVID vaccines. All of the tropes that were used against other vaccines were used for COVID. And that's when I said we're going to see a huge resurgence of anti-vax rhetoric and anti-vax people, because you can take every single myth about COVID vaccines and apply them to any vaccine. And that's what we're seeing now, is like people that fell into the rabbit hole because they decided they didn't want COVID vaccines, and then decided that now they don't want any vaccine.
Yeah. And you're absolutely right. It all gets recycled. Even the trope of injecting a rat intravenously with a vaccine and seeing the effects and using that as a reason to not vaccinate. We saw that with COVID vaccines. There was a study where rats or mice were injected intravenously with very large doses by relative to body weight of COVID vaccine, and it like calcified the mice heart, and they said, see, myocarditis. And it's like, well, not really, because that is,
I can assure
totally
you, it's not an IV injection. I gave a vaccine. I'm an expert in that now. It's not an IV injection.
It is. Intramuscular injections are very different from IV injections. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you went IV, you did it wrong.
Right. And you got it very wrong, because there's not even a vein big enough in the shoulder to get an intravenous injection.
No, it would be a very big freak accident. Like you tripped.
Right. You tripped and it went into their neck.
Yeah. Like you made a bad mistake.
Yeah. Oh, man. But the myths aren't going away. They're going to keep getting recycled and reused. And we just have to keep...
I saw Steve, what's his face, sharing the the polio DDT myth. And I was like,
oh,
dude, like,
right.
What year is it?
Yeah, honestly, did you just learn this myth yesterday?
Yeah.
Man.
He did.
Yeah, I mean, that's what he does. Yep. He just rediscovers myths that are 50 years old and
He
repackages
never
them.
answers when I talk about my son. He never answers because he'll be like, I don't know a single kid who was not vaccinated that's autistic. And I'm like, my son is autistic and he wasn't vaccinated till he was 5 or almost 5. And he always ignores, and he's tried to challenge me for a debate.
Oh, well, he ran from a debate with me in a group that was set up by someone else, but
Yeah.
I mean, that's what he does.
And he kept going back and forth, and like, I finally had enough, and I was like, you can pay me. And he was like, what do you want? And I told him, and he's like, no, I'm not gonna. I was like, okay, see you later.
Oh man, what an embarrassment he is to just every person
He's
on the planet.
really cringy. He's really cringy.
Yeah, but that's what you get with the anti-vax community. People like him.
And it just shows that it doesn't matter who they are or their character. They just like confirmation bias.
Right.
Because as a person, he's a terrible person.
Oh yeah.
Like, he used the most ableist photo of a child to say like vaccines cause autism, and the child had cerebral palsy. And he was like trying to scare parents, saying like, this is a representation of autism. And it was just the most ableist thing he could ever do. And it was nasty. And I was like, take it down. And he wouldn't. Because he's just an aberrant person.
Yeah, I mean, he stalks doctors and follows them to their house.
Okay. Yes. He has no like, he can't read a room.
No.
Like, he has no understanding of how cringy that is.
Right.
I guess that's my cue to leave.
All right.
You know me. I can go on.
All right. Well, we've had a good talk, and you have a family to get to. So, Lydia, thanks for coming on the channel. You are one of the good science communicators out there when it comes to vaccines, and I hope that more people notice and more medical offices pick up your booklet.
I hope so too. I think it is helpful. I hope.
I think so.
Otherwise, why would I try?
Right. All right, Leah. Well, thanks for joining, and you take care. And I'll put the links to your website and your podcast in the description. People can go check it out. And we'll see you next time.
All right. Have a good night.
See ya.